A ragged throng of barefoot children clutched a tattered banner as they stepped onto a crowded bridge over the Rhine, unaware that the journey would soon dissolve into mystery. It is the winter of 1212, and a sharp wind carries the scent of damp wood and smouldering hearths through the towns of the Rhineland. In the city of Cologne, a young itinerant preacher, referred to in the chronicles simply as a boy from Cologne, claimed to have received a vision that the Holy Land could be reclaimed without swords, that the innocent hearts of children might open the gates of Jerusalem. Contemporary chroniclers record that his words spread quickly, carried on the tongues of peasants exhausted by taxes, on the prayers of mothers who dreamed of a better life for their sons, and on the gossip of marketplace merchants who feared a loss of labor. Beat 1. The Spark of a Dream. The first surviving mention of the movement appears in a mid-13th century chronicle from Liege, which describes a gathering of boys and girls in the town square, their faces smeared with soot, their voices raised in a simple chant for God's aid. Clerics, uneasy but curious, offered shelter in parish halls, feeding the group with stale rye bread and thin broth. A handful of itinerant priests, themselves hoping for divine favor, pledged to lead the children toward the sea, believing that a tide of pure souls could miraculously part the waters. By early spring the procession resembled a river of white tunics and wooden staffs winding through the Rhineland. Chroniclers note the sight as a sea of white tunics, while later romantic accounts embellish it with a single, unified chant of *Deus nobis adjuvat*, God help us. The stakes were already high, famine gnawed at many villages, and the promise of a holy pilgrimage offered a glimmer of hope in a bleak landscape. Beat 2. The March Southward. The group split into two main streams. One headed west toward the Low Countries, hoping to reach the North Sea, the other turned south, following the Rhine downstream into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. Along the way the children confronted dense forests, swollen streams, and the harsh reality of hunger. Villages on the route responded in varied ways. Some turned them away, accusing the band of banditry, while others offered a loaf of rye in exchange for a prayer. A 13th century record from a monastery in Trier mentions that older youths, perhaps teenagers who had left their farms early, joined the ranks, blurring the line between children and adolescents. Estimates of the total number range widely. Scholars suggest anywhere from a few hundred to several thousand participants, acknowledging that contemporary chroniclers often exaggerated figures to stress moral lessons. The march was not a single, centrally organized army but a loose collection of local groups, each interpreting the original vision in its own way. Beat 3. The Encounter with Authority. By midsummer the southern stream reached the upper Rhine towns of Basel and Strasbourg. Local officials grew uneasy. A municipal record from Basel dated August 1212 notes that the council ordered officials to monitor wandering groups that might threaten public order, authorizing the temporary holding of such groups for questioning. Nearby town records mention that some of the youths were handed over to local merchants who needed cheap labor for agricultural estates and construction projects. The documents do not name individual buyers, but they do reference payments for youths from the wandering band that came from the north, suggesting that forced labor, rather than martyrdom, became a common fate. This intervention fragmented the movement. Instead of a unified march toward the sea, the group scattered under pressure from civic authorities and local lords. A letter from Pope Innocent III, preserved in the Vatican archives, expresses concern about the restless multitude that calls itself a pilgrimage and urges bishops to keep order and the safety of the faithful without endorsing the children's plan. Beat 4. The turn. New scholarship re-examines the myth. Recent research drawing on papal letters, municipal archives, and archaeological surveys of river crossings argues that the popular image of a massive, child-only caravan sailing from the Rhineland to the Mediterranean is largely a later medieval legend. A 2021 study in the Journal of Medieval Studies contends that the majority of participants never left the Upper Rhine region. Instead, they were turned back by hostile towns, absorbed into local labor markets, or, in a few documented cases, placed in servile positions within the German principalities. The same study points out that the liege chronicler, writing decades after the events, likely conflated separate movements of 1212 with earlier pilgrimages, creating a narrative that emphasized innocence and tragedy. Moreover, the study highlights that no contemporary source records a crossing of the Mediterranean or any arrival in the Levant. This recontextualization forces us to rethink earlier beats. The march was less a single, coordinated crusade and more a series of loosely connected migrations motivated by a mixture of religious fervor, economic desperation, and opportunism. Beat 5. The human cost and aftermath. Those who survived the encounters with authorities faced a bleak future. Some appear in the tax registers of southern French towns listed as servi, servants, attached to noble households. Others show up in muster rolls of Italian city-states as foreign laborers recruited during the same period. A handful of original participants managed to return north, their faces marked by the scars of hunger, disease, and forced labor. Monastic chronicles from the Abbey of St. Denis note the sorrow of mothers whose sons never returned, describing the scene in terms that later writers have rendered as a mournful silence over the village. While the exact phrasing varies among sources, the consensus is that communities felt a palpable loss when the groups dispersed. The exact number of deaths remains unknown. Estimates range from a few dozen to several hundred, reflecting the fragmentary nature of the sources. Archaeological excavations near the former bridge at Basel have uncovered a small burial pit dated to the early 13th century, containing the remains of youths of mixed ages, suggesting that disease and hardship claimed lives along the route. Final beat, an unresolved question. The Children's Crusade of 1212 remains a puzzle for historians. Was it a genuine, though misguided, attempt by a generation of youths to achieve a holy goal, or was the label Children's Crusade applied later to a broader social upheaval in which adults, peasants, and even minor nobles used the language of innocence to justify migration and labor exploitation? The ruins of medieval bridges that once carried these travelers still stand, silent witnesses to a story that is part fact, part legend. As the Rhine continues its slow flow beneath ancient stones, scholars continue to debate, if the movement had truly reached the sea, could it have altered the course of the Crusades, or would the children have simply become another footnote in a continent forever scarred by ambition? The river does not answer, but its waters keep moving, carrying with them the unanswered questions of a generation lost to history. In the end, the tale is less about a single catastrophic crossing and more about how medieval societies responded to crisis, how myths arise from incomplete records, and how the voices of the most vulnerable are amplified, or silenced, by the chroniclers who survive them. The Children's Crusade invites us to listen closely to the gaps, to question the narratives handed down through centuries, and to recognize that history is often a collage of truth, rumor, and the ever-shifting lens of interpretation.